Hello, anthropologist. Today we're going to be talking about kinship systems. And before we start, I would like to remind you about ethnocentrism. It's making judgments about another culture based on your own cultural system. So we're going to be talking about family constructions that are very, very different than yours. And it's going to be easy to say, yeah, that's just not right. What the heck are they doing? But traditions don't just appear out of nowhere. There's a solid basis for these practices that continue generation after generation after generation. Even if the original idea of why it happened is lost, there was something that made it useful, otherwise it would have gone away. So just set aside your judgments that are weird, and it's natural to feel your culture's the best. We all feel our culture's the best, but you can't understand another culture until you set that aside. So I'm asking you now, while we discuss these different cultures, to please set those ideas aside. Okay, so kinship. It's your membership, or a person's membership, in a family, and that relationship to the other members of the family. And kinship for us is something nice, it's something comforting. For other groups, that kinship determines what job they're going to have, who they can marry. Their life choices are very strongly influenced by or dictated by their kinship and where they stand in this family sphere. So keep that in mind, that kinship is more than just tracing your lineage. For a lot of cultures, it's critical. And it looks like biological ties, but it really isn't biological. Okay, it's based on biology. A mother has a kid, they're kin. That kid has siblings, they're kin. Those siblings have children, and there's that connection. And it is biological, but when we're talking about kinship, what we're talking about is the cultural understandings, the folk taxonomy, these cultural categories of what these relationships mean, what it means to be a cousin, what it means to be a father's brother or a mother's brother. Those differences, for us, we call both the father's brother and mother's brother uncle, but for some cultures, that is a very, very different distinction. And so these are cultural categories, and there's cultural variety. And I want you to see that they're cultural ideas put on top of a biological pattern. So, kinship ties predate us. Primates are social creatures. They have these bonds in which they respond to one another as individuals. They recognize their siblings, they recognize their mother, they recognize their grandmother, and they also have members in their group that they don't like and they don't want to spend time with. So these complex interactions predate humanity. Primate societies recognize individuals who are related. It's more than temporary. It's not just the instinctive bond of mother and offspring. It's a larger part of their social order. Sisters work together for mutual protection. Grandmothers are critical to the survival of their daughter's offspring. So these are really important bonds. Okay, chimps are really interesting. Remember, they're the most biologically close organism living to us. So chimps, if their mother gets hurt and can't get food on their own, chimps will bring their mom's food. Bonobos are a type of chimp. They're another species. So we have Pan troglodytes is common chimp, Pan paniscus is bonobo. And the bonobos have a matriarchal system, but that mother-son bond is really critical. It lasts a lifetime. Brothers in both groups have really strong relationships. Jane Goodall, in studying pantroglodytes, saw a pair of brothers. Neither one of them was strong enough to become alpha male on their own, but they worked together and shared alpha status when they were able to overthrow the alpha together. So I'm thinking that kinship bond was pretty important to their social position. Once again, they recognize their grandmothers, and we actually think that the reason human grandmothers live so long, because most animals, they don't live forever past reproductive age, but humans, we have this nice long span after we're no longer able to produce young. We still keep living, and we think that our common ancestor with the chimps, there was selective pressure for grandmothers that were still alive. They helped the next generations have a more successful life. So by having a grandmother, that grandchild offspring was more likely to survive, so there was selective pressure for grandmothers to keep living. So this is called the grandmother hypothesis, and it's really neat, and it's completely off topic, so I'm going to change now. Okay, so to humans, because I find them personally more interesting. For most of our evolutionary history, society and family were synonymous. Remember when we were talking about foragers? They live in small related bands. So 4 brothers, their wives, their children. That was your immediate social circle. They would meet with other bands and hang out, and like they would exchange young people when they became interested in each other. And so a young woman in this band would move with her boyfriend's band, and they would go off then. So I know that was very badly worded, but you see the point, that your entire social circle for the vast majority of the year was with people you were immediately related to. So society and family were the same. Social units were made of these small nuclear families. But we get bigger. Social actions get more complex. When we get food production, remember we go from about 30 people to 100 people in a horticultural group. And then once we get farming, kaboom, thousands or hundreds of thousands. So we needed to figure out how to regulate these social relationships. And we had this biological template. Mother, father, children, grandchildren. We had this idea, but it didn't quite work because there were so many unrelated people, or so many distantly related people in this bigger society. So we have a biological basis, but then we start putting these social categories, and we're kin with these people and we're not kin with these people. So they're not natural groupings. They're geared to the population, they're geared to the cultural system, and each culture does kinship somewhat differently. If you're interested, this is a picture of Tsar Nicholas's wedding because I found it pretty. Okay, so as I said, a model already existed, family relationships. Food-producing societies created cultural variations on biological themes. These systems look biological, but they're cultural. Okay, and there's another form of polygamy, and this is polyandry. Polyandry is where a woman has more than one husband. And in this picture, this is a picture of fraternal polyandry. It's practiced in Nepal and the Himalayan mountains, in little bits of India, in which land is really scarce and hard to come by. I'm going to link a video at the bottom of this so you can watch a family talking about this. But a woman will marry into a family of brothers, and then she moves in to their home with their parents, and then her sons will live in that house and marry a woman, and her daughters will find other spouses outside of the house. And the reason we do this is because land is scarce. Imagine you have 4 brothers and you have a few acres. You cut up these, okay, say it was 4 acres. Each of these sons now gets an acre to farm with their family. Well, that's not going to work, because in the next generation, if each of those had 4 sons, each of those sons gets 1/4 of an acre, and then 1/8 of an acre, and then 1/16, and after a few generations, you can grow a potato. So this is, and England was solving this by the rule of primogeniture, where the eldest son is the one who inherits the land. But then what do you do with all these extra brothers? So that's not a good solution in this community. In this community, everyone, all the men born into this family, work the same bit of land. One of them will drive the oxen, the other will become a traveling merchant. Some will stay home and tend the produce. So this is a family as a corporate organization, that they're working together for the good. And yes, all these men and this wife, not simultaneously, but over the course of months, years, all engage in sexual relations. They don't say, okay, this child belongs to this father and this child belongs to this father. The children belong to these fathers. So that, once again, put aside your ethnocentrism and see the reason why this cultural practice continues. If it wasn't working, it wouldn't have kept on. Before I start, I want to say, it looks like the majority of the world's cultures would be monogamous, but that's not true. We just have a skewed perspective because the hegemonic powers that came and peopled the New World were from an agricultural people. Advanced agricultural people tend to be monogamous. So these huge populations are from agricultural people. Agricultural groups are monogamous. They're the ones that became the global hegemons. So only 25% of the world's cultures practice monogamy as the rule. 75% of the world's cultures practice some form of polygamy, which is multiple spouses. So 75% of the world, the cultures, are polygamous. Of course, they tend to be from smaller cultural groups. So it changes our perspective. But the number of spouses varies from culture to culture. While pair bonding is useful and formalized marriage practices are a rule, how we practice marriages is not the rule. And look at this picture. This is a prince and his favorite wives. Imagine the ones not in the picture, and imagine the conversations when they get back home. Anyway, so think about it. The majority of the world practices some form of polygamy. Okay, there's 2 kinds of polygamy. There's polygyny, where a man has multiple wives. Thinking of the root word gynecologist is the same root that is polygyny. So polygynous families are more complex. Co-wives have to try to get along or have their own social interactions. The children of each of these co-wives have to interact and try to get along. So it's a much more complex household than the man, wife, and their however many children. Okay, I said that there's 2 kinds of polygamy. This is, in the past, talking about traditional cultural social practices. I'm not talking about modern forms of polyamory, which is different and doesn't necessarily follow any particular cultural patterns. I just need to say that. And this picture, I can't find any more details on it. It was Afghan rug merchants, their wives and children. And I've been trying to find out more on this picture for years, but I'm not finding anything. But it leaves us open to speculation, and it's a really neat picture to analyze. Polygyny is most often practiced in horticulture and non-industrial agricultural societies. Of course, as you saw in the video about pastoralists, they too practice polygyny. And the reason for this is it is able to create a lot of working people really fast. You have 4 wives, each of them have 2 or 3 children over a few years, and they're all able to help produce food and bring it to society. Of course, these co-wives are able to take breaks when they're pregnant and not work. They can divide labor, so there's a lot of benefits when the entire extended family is the unit of production. This produces a lot of food for the community very fast. Monogamy is practiced in foraging hunter-gatherer communities, in advanced agricultural communities, and of course in our industrial agricultural communities. And the reason the foragers practice it is because, well, polygyny definitely wouldn't work because we don't want to create a lot of people really fast. Remember, they limit their birth spacing and make sure that they don't have babies too close at the same time because, well, breastfeeding is very energy intense on the mother, and the land doesn't support that many people. So the fewer people there are in that band, the better it is for the land to support them. There, the entire band is the unit of economic production, and in our culture, well, advanced agriculture and industrial culture, the individual and the nuclear family is the means of production. So large families in both of these cases put a strain on the ability to provide resources. So both of these groups have the same reasoning on why they're monogamous. Also, when we're talking about this later, they also use bilateral kinship systems. So both foragers and advanced agricultural people use bilateral, where you're equally related to both sides of your family, which this isn't the norm in pastoralist communities, in horticultural communities, and in early or simpler agriculture in which the entire extended family is that unit of production. So being related to only one, either the matrilineal or the patrilineal side, is in their best interest. In ours, it's being related to both sides is in our interest. As I already said, for the foragers, their whole society, their whole band is the economic unit. Sharing is the focus. So they get an animal and they equitably distribute the animal food to the members of their community. You're gathering plant material, you're gathering it for everybody to share. And that's how their group stays healthy. And the more people you get, the more strain there is, because this is naturally occurring food. Polygyny just doesn't work well. There's not a lot of extra people, so the male to female ratio, some men would have a lot of wives if we did polygyny, and then some wouldn't. And remember, they strive for egalitarianism. If some people could have more wives, it puts a strain. Of course, there are incidents where a shaman will be able to have a couple of wives, but this isn't the rule among hunter-gatherers. And in a completely different direction, I'm going to discuss dowry. Dowry, you might be familiar with. This is where a bride's family will give the groom's family goods or jewelry or money in exchange for marrying their daughter. But this isn't the actual purpose of dowry. And dowry is money given as part of the marriage package to this young couple from the bride's family. This is supposed to be a nest egg, as a way of ensuring her and her children will be provided for. I'm going to link a video below called Angry Brides, and it's a newscast about how it's gone wrong in India, and it's been illegal since the 1950s there. But this is a cultural practice that was standard, and now some people had corrupted it, and the government's trying to regulate this. And in the poor classes, it's not as much a problem. In the richer classes, giving big gifts to the family is expected, and it doesn't come at a cost. In the middle classes, it ended up being a problem because some families saw this as a way to gain more wealth. So there would be an arrangement set where, okay, you provide so much gold jewelry, so much money, a refrigerator, and the bride will marry this groom. But some really terrible people were then saying, we now need more dowry or we'll hurt your daughter. And so it ended up being a hostage situation that's still actually occurring. But remember, our European ancestors, because most of us do have some European ancestors, if you're watching in the New World. So our European ancestors used to pay dowry. On the flip side of this, in a lot of countries in Africa, in parts of the Middle East, there's bridwealth, where the groom's family pays the bride's family. And now they're being given wealth, one, in exchange for her labor and her potential offspring's labor, but also to show, hey, look, we have enough, we can provide. So bridwealth's common in a lot of the Middle East. The groom's family is the one that's expected to pay for the wedding festivities, which is very different than traditions here in the United States, where it's usually the bride's family that pays. So this is part of that bridwealth, who pays for the wedding. And if you think this is better, this too has problems. So if a woman wants to leave her husband, her family's got to refund the bride wealth paid, and it still ends up being a problematic situation. But these all come from very good cultural ideas, but we have these larger communities where people's families aren't there to monitor this, and that's when things get strange. This is interesting, and we don't tend to think about it, but once a young couple is married, where do they live? This too is culturally specific. When the young couple moves in with the bride's family, or next door to the bride's family, or within the bride's village, that's called matrilocal residence patterns. So that's, once again, moving in with the bride's family. The opposite of that is patrilocal residence, in which the new couple moves in with the groom's family, or in that same village. That's patrilocal residence. So, which of these patterns do Americans follow? So, okay, we're taught that we should be neo-local here in the United States, that young couples should get their own house, quite often in a completely different city than either of their families. This is becoming actually less common than it used to be, in the fact that a lot of young couples aren't able to afford their own households, and they do move in with their families. But because of our bilateral kinship patterns, because that kin grouping doesn't mean as much to us on a societal level, but just on a personal level, we move in with whoever makes sense. But the ideal, what we're taught, is neo-local's the way to go. This has benefits in that you don't have your in-laws there telling you everything you're doing is wrong, that the house has more space, each child gets its own room. And so there's benefits to that, but the drawbacks are young mothers have to figure out if this crying baby should go to a doctor or is just crying because it's teething. So not having someone who's gone through it in your household makes a difference. There's more isolation. And of course, not having the extended family right there means that you don't have as much support. You don't have someone to mind your children or help you out if someone is too ill to cook the dinner. So, benefits and drawbacks. Now we're getting to the technical part, and this is actually the most technical of all the anthropology lectures I do. Linguistics is up there. I think this one's actually way more technical. So we're going to be talking about both extended family, that's nuclear families linked by blood, inhabiting the same location, give or take. So your families that aren't your immediate mother, father, children, you're talking about uncles, aunts, grandparents, cousins, your extended family. Your descent line is nuclear families connected over time. Grandmother, daughter, granddaughter, great-granddaughter, that's a descent line. And once again, we're in both of our descent lines, we're bilateral. The extended family now. Families aren't isolated. Say a man has 7 sisters and a woman has 4 brothers. This is a lot of lateral extended family. So how many uncles and aunts are these kids going to have? And each of those families might have several children, so we're talking about dozens, sometimes hundreds of cousins. So in cultures that use unilateral kinship, not having to reckon everybody on both sides of the family is actually a lot easier. So the families I just described, the man with 7 sisters and the wife with 4 brothers, the children born of that couple will not have any parallel cousins, they'll only have cross cousins. So in some cultures, they would only be related to the cross cousins on their father's side. So eliminating half of those people from the people they directly consider kin if the mother's side is part of a now different lineage if they marry into a man's household. I know that's confusing. We're going to be talking about this in a moment. And of course, there's vertical extended family, once again, that over time, the descent line with grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, etc. That's vertically, and I already discussed horizontally. As I mentioned, most cultures around the world only decide on looking at one side of the family. It's either matrilineal, looking at the mother's side of the family, or patrilineal, looking at the father's side of the family. In what way is our U.S. culture, and British culture quite often, patrilineal? I said we were bilateral, but there's in one instance where we tend to be very patrilineal. Okay, I'll tell you because you can't answer me. Our surnames. So, children in a family will traditionally now, because it's not practiced as widely as it used to be, but children will get their father's surname, and the women will marry someone else and get their husband's surname and pass on his name to that next generation, whereas the sons of the original family will keep passing down their name and their sons will pass on that name. Of course, this is not true of a lot of cultures. So, kinship can be tricky and very confusing. So, I'm going to be using the standard method of diagrams for families. I'm going to be showing you the exact same biological family unit, But because I'm showing you 3 different kinship systems, there's more than 3, but I'm showing you 3 different kinship systems, we're going to use the exact same diagram, but the colors are going to show you the difference between what we're calling the folk taxonomies of the different cultural categories. So if you look here, this is ego. Forgive my handwriting. Ego. Ego is the point of reference for all our kinship diagrams. So if this is ego, then this person right here would be mother, because circles are women. So ego in this case is a woman. The one I put a check mark on is also a woman. This would be ego's mother. If ego was this person with the check plus, then the one I check marked up here would be grandmother. So ego is the point of view. So for these kinship diagrams, circles are women, triangles are men. Remember that any way you so choose. Equal signs mean marriage. The vertical line is the descent line that we already discussed. The horizontal line is, the official word is sibship, and I hate that word. But the horizontal line shows that these two are brother and sister. So we're going to be moving on now that you have the basics. I mean, if the equal sign has this through it, it means they're divorced. If a person has a line through them, it means that one's deceased. If a person has a dotted line, they call it fictive kinship, and that means adoption. But I don't have any of these special ones on the next few kinship charts. This is just basic, simple stuff. Okay. This states what I did before. This one's slightly more complicated. Ego has a mother and a father. This mother had a sister and a brother. This father had a brother and a sister. Each of them had 2 children. This is pretty much like the other ones I'm going to be showing you. Okay. I already said this. I'm going to delete this slide. Remember, most groups are unilineal, one-sided. I keep saying this, but I need it in your mind that it makes sense when you're not writing this down because it's a non-literate society. Then having to memorize 16 generations back or 20 generations back, if you have to remember both sides, that's going to get somewhat cumbersome. Whereas if you have to memorize one side, it makes a lot more sense. That's not just the only reason they do it, but it makes it a lot easier. And this is important because it determines who you're going to marry. It determines whether you're going to be a priest or a hunter or the leader of the community. So these kinship ties are critical. We do it different here because we go to school. We choose majors in college. So it's our social class and other life circumstances that determine our life path and not our lineage. So the Eskimo system is a bilateral system. This is the one most forager groups practice it, and this is the one we here in the United States typically practice. So ego is represented by a square, so put yourself there. Ego has a brother and sister, a mother and father. Each of the mother and father have a brother and sister. In the United States, we call all these children of the uncles and aunts cousins, right? We have one word for them, therefore they're the same color. If you speak Spanish or French or German, they're not all cousin, say they're prima and primo. They would have each a different color because they would be marked by gender based on the language of the speaker. I hope that makes sense. So nuclear family is the most important. If only one person gets that cultural category, like father, you know that father is an important marked category here. Mother is important marked. We have a bunch of uncles, we have a bunch of aunts, or we could, but we could only typically have one mother and father in our culture. And brothers and sisters are circumscribed. Only the children of that mother and father can be our brothers and sisters here. This is not universal, remember. I'm moving on. The Hawaiian system here. The Hawaiian system, they're only marked by sex and by generation. So, the Hawaiian system, everybody, all the father's brothers and the mother's brothers are referred to by something equivalent to father. It's a 4-syllable word that I can't pronounce. Also, the mother's sisters and the father's sisters are also all referred to by a word that's the equivalent of mother. And in Ego's generation, everybody, all the actual siblings and all the cousins are all just brother and sister. So this doesn't mean that Ego doesn't know who his or her biological parents are. They know, but these cultural categories, the social responsibility is on everybody in the parental generation. Everybody in Ego's generation are tied officially equally to one another here. So these are cultural categories. You know who your biological siblings are, but the social categories are, these are all my brothers and sisters. There's symmetry here. So this is a definite bilateral system. It's the simplest for us to get our heads around the naming of it, mother, father, brother, sister, but it's very different than the isolated nuclear family that we have in our system. The Omaha system is the most complex I'm going to talk about here today. Ego's father's side has more categories. I mean, it's hard to tell from this little chart because it doesn't go up or down beyond the 2 generations, but there's more categories on the father's side. Therefore, that's the side that's the most important. So if you look here, and this is so complex, and I'm sorry about this. On the mother's side here, this is mother. Biologically, this is the mother. But this woman also has the same category. So maternal relative, maternal relative, maternal relative. And then we have these men. These women all have the same category. These men have the same category. This is male maternal relative, and this is male maternal relative. So everybody on the mother's side is lumped into people I'm related to on my mother's side of the family. If you look at this right here, so we would call 13 and 14 and 15 and 16 all cousins to us. But in the Omaha system here, all these children here are no longer cousins to Ego. They are also brother and sister. So why would these cousins be brother, sister, and these cousins over here and these cousins over here not be considered brother and sister? Well, I'm glad you asked that. These are actually cross cousins. So cross cousins are, this is difficult. Cross cousins are the opposite sex siblings' children. So see, number 3 is father. This father is also, or this brother is also called father. It's the same cultural category. So father and father produce siblings. mother and mother produce siblings. Here, father's opposite sex sibling, his sister, is going to produce what we call cross cousins. These are parallel cousins. Here, parallel cousins. Hey, at least I'm not leading a football chart, because then you wouldn't know where to run. But parallel cousins, cross cousins. Got it? So opposite sex sibling produces cross cousins. Here we go. Why are these 7 and 8 different colors now? And the important question is, why would ego, based on ego's gender, of course, why would ego be allowed to marry either 7 or 8? Okay, now that you've thought about it, what's going on here? Let me erase some of this nonsense. Okay, so what's going on here is, since this is a patrilineal society, and number 1 here, number 3 sister is a woman. You can tell by her being a circle. So she is marrying a man. Surprise. So these children here are now part of a completely different lineage, and ego's not really that related to 7 or 8, and 7 and 8 now are potential marriage partners because they're in a different lineage. I told you this was complicated. So there's an incest taboo. So parallel cousins in some cultures are far too closely related, so they would fall under the incest taboo. Cross cousins from now another lineage, whether it's matrilineal or patrilineal, that'll be different. But these cross cousins are now not really related to one. Of course, some cultures this doesn't matter, and cousin marriages in general are practiced around the world. And they're the preferred marriage partner because you know their family, you know that they're going to have the same religion, the same cultural structure. It solidifies power within the family. So cousin marriages are widely practiced. And you're going to bring up that there could be genetic abnormalities. Cousins only share 12% of their DNA, unless there's some horrific thing like the old royal line with hemophilia or Tay-Sachs disease or some terrible recessive trait. Cousin marriages are not harmful and, as I said, preferred for many cultures around the world. And I said that in some cultures, the mother and the mother's line isn't important. That is officially for social rights and responsibilities. But just because these social recognitions aren't there, personal recognition still is, and people will know their mothers. They'll know who their biological parents are, even if they're calling every man and woman in their parents' generation mother and father. They still have these connections. They still have these sentimental ties. So I don't want you to think that just because, say that aunt is now in a completely different lineage, ego doesn't love her. So I want you guys to know that. Okay, I've already mentioned this, so I'm going to delete this slide. Just a reminder, your parallel cousins, your father's brother's children. Your mother's sister's children are your parallel cousins. Your cross cousins are your father's sister's kids and your mother's brother's kids. This is going to be tested, so get it in your minds. There are, of course, other ways to organize a tribe or a village outside of kinship lines. A very common way is age sets. So say for the first 13 years of a boy child's life, he's a child. At around age 13, all the boys around that age block get circumcised. It's their coming of age ceremony where they become men and they graduate into the warriors group. And then, after about 12, 13 years of being warriors, that next set of boys under them that come of age get circumcised and become warriors. Not quite displaces, but that next set that was warriors graduates to be allowed to get married. And then in another 12, 13 years, they then become elders. These age sets, think about your school cohort. You're a first grader, you get out of that, you're a second grader, you're a third grader, then your cohort somehow ends up in middle school. And in small towns, those middle school kids all go through those 3 years together, and then they become high school kids. So we kind of have a little bit of age sets, not of course anything official like it is for these tribal communities where that sets their status in the community. So social organization is broad, it's complex, and so society is organized around factors such as age, sex, and kinship, just as a way to categorize people. Another way to do it is men's associations. These men live together. It's a group based on gender. There's also, of course, women's groups. But these men's associations stand as a very important cultural category. Oh, and this picture is from a men's organization in the United States. You might be familiar with it, the Young Men's Christian Association. Or as you might know it, the YMCA. It was actually a very political group back in the 1870s. They were important in getting birth control and abortion made illegal. So these men's groups in America had a lot of power. Anthony Comstock was with the YMCA, but it didn't have the same meaning that it does now. Okay, that's just trivia. I just wanted to put it in there because before the 1870s, birth control and abortion were legal. So ways of organizing societies is political organizations, secular, non-kinship means of organizing us. And so bands are these small, independent, autonomous groups that are related in some way, membership's flexible, and they come together during festivities, during important times. People intermarry between these bands, but they're autonomous. They each rule themselves. Tribes are more structured, but each one is still able to mostly function on their own, but they get together for mutual defense. Chiefdoms are centralized powers that work together. So there'll be villages. These villages have a leadership. These leaders get together, and then the state is what we're the most familiar with, where each unit, say the counties, report to the state then reports to the federal government. So remember, for the most of human development, society and family were the same. Once food production began, you can see human interactions become more complex. Bands don't produce food. Tribes tend to produce just enough for their group, but no more. Chiefdoms, they help provide for an authority figure, but that authority figure isn't permanent. And then, of course, the state, where we actually pay taxes. So bands are the simplest non-political organization based on kinship, characteristic of foraging societies, small, autonomous, no social stratification. Tribes, political organization with no central leader, but which the subunits make collective decisions for the entire group. Chiefdoms, a political organization made up of groups of interacting units. Each one has its own chief or leader, and these chiefs work together for the good of that entire society. And finally, we have the state. The state is tied to agricultural communities where farming is important, where people have to pay taxes, where the land has to be defended from other people trying to take it. It's a political organization with one central authority governing all the individual units. Of course, there are a few exceptions to the farming rule for states. The Quiahutal people in the Pacific Northwest, the native South Floridians, and a few others around the world were able to have a state-level political organization without farming, but that's because the natural resources, say in South Florida, there's so much seafood that you could just walk out, grab some oysters, grab some clams. There's pond apples everywhere. There's a ton of naturally occurring food, so they didn't have to farm. And they were able to create large, stable populations just through gathering. But for the most part, states are tied to agriculture. So that is the entirety of this presentation. I just wanted you to understand how subsistence patterns affect kinship understanding, how subsistence patterns affect marriage, how these marriage practices are tied to the use of the land. So that's it, and take care. See you all next week.